Welcome back to Derry Public Radio. Reporting from the basement of the Derry Civic Center, this is CM Alexander with the news. Haven's citizens have reported a toxic green glow appearing over their city at night. A representative from the Maine Air Force released a statement listing possible sources of such light. We at the station have a betting pool on which truth it is this time. For my money, I'm betting it all on packs of moths. You are listening to Derry Public Radio. This is Derry Public Radio. Welcome back to Derry Public Radio, a bi-weekly Stephen King book club podcast. I'm one of your hosts, CM Alexander, alongside Joshua Kahn.
Hey, everybody.
And Benjamin Graham.
I'm back, constant readers. What's up?
Hey, Ben!
And today we are covering book 1 of the Tommyknockers, if you are following along, and if not, major spoilers ahead. And Josh is leading our discussion.
All right. Man, I'm so excited to jump into this book. First of all, I should say that now that we're back doing these books, we finally can get back to the books that have been picked by our Patreon supporters. And Tommyknockers was chosen by Casey Bauer. And she and the other Patreon people who had their books put on hold have been so gracious about all this. So I'm very, very excited.
And can I say, Casey, good fucking choice.
There's so much more in this book to talk about than I ever would have guessed.
Is this one of his best? No. Is it a fucking roller coaster? Yes. Yes, please.
Absolutely. So book 1 is titled The Ship in the Earth, and it opens up with Roberta Anderson, or Bobby, and her dog Peter walking through the forest. She's gonna chop up some wood because she has a house in the middle of the country, and on her way back she stumbles upon something very interesting in the woods. CM, what does she stumble upon?
She stumbles upon a tin can. Oh, no, wait, she thinks that's what it is, but it is something way, way cooler, okay, so Ben, I've actually been really excited to ask you this specifically because I don't know that Josh is as big a fan.
Right.
Do you know the influence for the Tommyknockers?
Well, I know that at some point he mentions the day when the earth stood still, but I get very big The Thing vibes.
Okay, what about The Color Out of Space?
No, that makes sense, though. That is a great story.
Yeah, so for our listeners who may not be familiar with Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, it was a 1920s story. This guy's telling us a story about a town in Massachusetts that experienced a meteorite crash. It initially made all of the vegetation grow really huge and looked really great and people were excited. But when they cut into it, it tasted really horrible. There was something off and wrong with it. And the animals started to become deformed and the people eventually all went crazy and started to die. And there was a 1987 movie starring Will Wheaton based off of it. It's okay, but it doesn't quite capture all the Lovecraft majesty. But then Richard Stanley in 2019 did an adaptation that is really freaking cool.
Starring Nicolas Cage.
What?
Yeah.
Yes. And Richard Stanley himself, we could have a whole episode just talking about that guy's crazy journey too.
What's the Nicolas Cage movie called?
Color Out of Space.
Oh, yeah. I've never heard of this.
Yeah, it's about a sentient color that is bad.
Yeah, and it's this color that we've never seen it before.
Yeah.
So it's A Color Out of Space.
That's amazing. Well, we got to watch that.
Yeah,
very excited.
That makes sense. There are, I feel like, a lot of influences on, and late in this first part, he kind of hangs a lampshade on it. One of our two protagonists, although, sees this flying saucer. There's an extended riff of him going, it had to be a flying saucer. How fucking lame is that?
Yeah, I love that.
That's so cliche. No self-respecting sci-fi author would put a flying saucer in their book, and we're like, come on, Stephen King.
Oh, yeah, I love this, Steve. I can feel him winking at me as he's writing that. So she stumbles across this tiny piece of metal sticking out of the earth, and she grabs it to pull it out, and when she touches it, it vibrates. which I just think is eerie as hell.
It's a dildo.
Somebody buried their sharp metal dildo out in the wilderness.
It's my woods dildo.
You
Sometimes you just gotta get freaky in the woods.
You guys, you've got this wrong. It doesn't vibrate. She specifically says, like,
Oh,
it's
you're
too
right.
in the ground. Like,
Yes.
it's stuck. It's like bedrock. No, it's a psychic vibration. That's nothing. This is the first instance of just absolute nonsense that we get in this book. We should mention Tommyknockers has like a reputation,
Yeah,
right?
it does.
I feel like every person that is like, I don't like Stephen King and has never read Stephen King, but has a very clear idea of what his books are. This is the book they're imagining.
I believe, Ben, you were the one who told me this, was that Tommyknocker was written deep in the throes of cocaine.
This is the quintessential King Coke book.
Got it.
You can tell, especially in the character of Gardner. Like,
oh God, I love Gardner.
the chapter that, we're gonna have a talk. Yeah, he was coked out of his mind. And I did some research on Wikipedia that King himself, in a later interview, had this to say about Tommyknockers. It's a horrible book. So yeah, it's a psychic vibration.
See,
Whatever that is.
yeah, I took it as more of that sensation being that she felt vibrating when it couldn't possibly be vibrating. And I think that's what made it a little eerie to me, when you have those two things that, like, this could not possibly be happening, yet I'm feeling it. Well, she decides that she tries to wiggle it. It doesn't come out, so she starts digging and digs a foot or more out, and it's still going on. And poor Peter, her adorable old ass dog that she keeps, every time she talks about Peter, she's like, well, he'll be dead soon, and that's rough. And Peter's just shivering with fear. And then finally, she can't stop digging. When Peter barks, she's like, "Oh, I've been digging so much. We should get the hell home."
Yeah, she loses time.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question to you guys.
Sure.
About Bobby Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
This character, I really love Bobby. She's a really cool character. She's just kind of a hermit that is a writer, of course, that lives in the Maine woods by herself with her old dog. But when I read this in high school, I thought Bobby was old.
I could see why you would think that.
Right?
She's 30?
She's
in her 30s?
30, in her mid-30s.
Yeah.
She is, I believe,
She's like our age.
37 or 39. She is not old.
She has a very old soul.
She does. Everything that she does, she just like sits and reads her memoirs and stuff in this house. It's constantly talking about her gray hair, and she's constantly thinking about death and how old she's getting. When I first read this book, I imagined her as like an old lady.
I only didn't imagine her that way because when it described, because
Right.
I'm 36. I just turned 36. Yay.
Hey, happy birthday.
Hey.
I was like, oh, she's like my age just about. And so that kind of stuck with me. But when you brought it up, it's like, yeah, if you hadn't mentioned her age, I would have assumed her to be retirement age.
Yeah, because she's fine living out in this isolation, and she's got her pattern of taking care of herself.
Yeah.
So yeah, she definitely feels older. I also, and they talk about it later, that Gardner met Bobby when he was her teacher.
Gross.
And,
I was just going to, thank you.
and so I kept losing track because my brain wanted to say, oh, they're the same age.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're not.
College professor.
College professor,
Slightly
yes.
better.
It is a
Ugh,
little bit better.
I guess.
Position of power he has over her is not, but
Sure.
at least she's more than 18.
And then when she gets home, it was the second instance we hear of Jim Gardner. One was that he bought Peter for Bobby. The next is that we see that Bobby is an author. She has books that she's published. And Jim Gardner published her first book of poems. And then they slept together. So the position of power thing, you just said it, and
Yeah.
it's really coming back.
I'm going to make you eat the words, I like Jim Gardner, Josh.
All right, I'm here for it.
I actually like how this book is structured. Because the first several chapters, I know I talked to you guys the first time, we had to read this first section twice because of world events and so on. But the first time we were reading it through, I know that you guys were like, we're 3 chapters in and nothing is happening. But I like how it's structured because we spend these first couple of chapters with Bobby, getting to know her and her routine and what she's like before switching over to the chaos that is Jim Gardner's life.
That night, she sleeps pretty soundly, except for the little situation where she has a nightmare about green light making her teeth fall out. Who hasn't had that dream?
It's so upsetting, though.
Oh, yeah, it's super fucked up. I like that when she looks in the mirror, though, she, like, wiggles her tooth just to be sure.
It's described so vividly. You have the dream. I've never had the dream and felt the teeth pool in my mouth.
Oh, like, so gross. She comes to find out that she slept for 12 goddamn hours. Like, she was out. But she can't stop thinking about digging up whatever this is. At this point, she's decided it's some clandestine coffin, and that so there's going to be someone or something in there. So she goes out and takes some tools with her and decides to dig, and then again she loses track of time. It's suddenly 3 p.m. and she's lost herself completely. Peter barks at her. She acknowledges it, goes back to it, and then another 4.5 hours pass. But when she comes back to it, she notices that she has just bled all over herself. And that's just another level of, I guess, playing through the pain. Because it's... So we're introduced very early on to the fact that once she's here, she does not control herself anymore. Time is gone, and it's like something else is driving her. Every time she starts thinking about this and kind of goes into that zone.
And she's weirdly completely okay with it.
Yeah! She's very chill about it. But denial's a real powerful thing.
I thought King did a good job writing her in that brief amount of time, because we haven't been with her very long, but we already know that it is not normal for her to just be like, yeah, whatever. I can't stop thinking about this, but that's okay.
It's fine.
And the way Peter reacts to it, the way she doesn't react to his reaction is also very telling.
The fact of the matter that she notices, I've lost nearly 7 hours out here, bled through my pants, and am scraped up and have been digging, but she still has a hard time leaving and going home that night. She still doesn't want to go. And this is also, she thinks about calling someone to report this, and she's like, I could call the police, or I could call a poet. That's the angle. Let's call the poet. And that's when we find out Gardner is on this poetry tour, which is a thing.
I guess.
Yeah.
The Northeast, I mean, I bought it. Sounds right.
And she finally comes to the idea, she sees how much she's dug out and takes a piece of paper and a compass and tries to determine how big this thing is, and determines it could be 300 yards in circumference buried underneath the earth.
Okay, was it just me, or did this seem like nonsense?
Absolute nonsense. Because it's purely just guessing. That's all it is.
Yeah, she like literally draws, she admits, she's like, I'm not handy, I've never been good at drawing, and she's doing it from memory.
Yeah.
Like, she goes back to her house, and she's like, it probably looked like this, and if I set the compass to a completely random size,
arbitrary angle.
Oh my god, it's so big. Which, of course, turns out to be completely correct.
Yeah.
But that's beside the point.
Yeah, and that's when she decides that she knows it's a flying saucer. And then our first, beyond the absence of time, the first real spooky thing happens. She's feeding Peter, and as we discussed, Peter's getting old. He's on his deathbed almost. She has to, like, mix his food with water so that it's easier to chew. And she looks into his eye, and this cataract that was making him blind in one eye is almost completely gone.
Every time she talks about Peter and describes anything, I'm like making this grimace because, okay, you guys know how I feel about animals being hurt in things. I think that's part of the reason I had trouble my first read through getting into it, because it's like, oh my God, this dog is going to die. And I don't want to read that. I don't want to read about it. I don't know. They just have this wonderful life together, this very peaceful kind of country, simple life. And it's just peppered with sadness.
You just know. Well, I mean, it's the first few chapters of a King novel. You know something bad's going to happen. Weirdly, though, the opposite of something bad is happening.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Yeah, because she takes him to the vet, which is in a nearby town a couple miles away, I believe.
What, like 3 chapters in, and this is the first exciting thing that happens is a vet appointment.
I actually did have a really hard time with the vet appointment scene because she
Really?
Yeah, not the first part because she gets him in there. The vet checks him out, and she even notices that he's like leaping off the table.
Yeah.
With more mobility than he normally would be. And she's kind of frustrated because her vet isn't as impressed or doesn't seem to notice. And it's like a newer vet than what she used to have. And she makes this comment, like, if he had noticed, I could have admitted something. And that would have sort of like, oh, it's his fault. I could have been saved, but he didn't notice this. And so it didn't force me to admit it. I don't think she would have admitted that she'd been digging something in the woods.
No, of course not.
Just that denial is interesting because it's another character that you don't even realize at first has an addiction problem.
Oh, for sure. One of the things that I thought was really neat is that King makes a Benjamin Button reference before it was a reference.
No, well, it was a book.
It was
a very
book,
old book.
Yeah.
So,
Stephen King predicts Benjamin Button movie.
But so many people didn't know about it until the
Yeah.
movie came out, at least as far as like anybody I knew, really.
Right.
And so I thought that was it's very apt because the color is like coming back, his old fur is coming back, and he just looks younger and is acting younger.
Yeah, I love the vet scene.
It was
because of what
leaving.
happens as they're leaving.
Then please tell us about what happens
okay.
next.
I only hate what happens as they're leaving because this goes back to the writing style, which I'm going to get into when we talk about Jim. But I swear to God that she walked out of there one tiny baby step at a time.
Yeah, it takes a while. So as they're leaving, like the doctor opens the door and all of the animals in the waiting room start losing their mind. Dogs barking and
Cats hissing.
A Pomeranian bites with the force of a shark.
Pomeranian bites a fat woman because Stephen King hates fat people.
Oh, yeah, that was rough.
Not great. Yeah, a snake that Bobby says should not act aggressively rears up like a cobra towards Peter. And Peter is actively fighting back and like trying to pull at the leash to get these other animals, and she has to drag him out. Sam, you are correct. It does take seemingly a half an hour.
The scene itself drags out.
Oh, for sure. But I like that she points out for the first and only time she can ever remember, she sees hate and rage in her dog's eyes.
And for a moment, it was directed at her, which is totally new.
Which brings me to my next question. CM, can dogs scare away your period?
If they can, I'm getting a dog.
Because we go through the hour and a half it takes to get out of this vet, and she gets outside, everything's normal, they get back into the truck, and after all this chaos has gone on, she just has this afterthought that's like, oh, and my period stopped. So I assume those were tied.
I think it stopped because we find this out a little bit later, but I think she stopped like eating and stuff, and that can affect your hormones.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
Well, I think it's the obvious that she's outside of the influence of the ship.
That too.
But we kind of figure that out later because she has to drive out of town, or into town rather, because she, like we've said, she's kind of a hermit and she lives on the outskirts of Haven.
That night, there's a big storm in Haven and the power goes out. Except for there's still some light shining through her house because Bobby opens her eyes and there's just this eerie green light, very reminiscent of the green light from her dreams. And she's looking around to see where it's coming from. And it's coming from Peter's eye. More accurately, coming from the cataract in Peter's eye. How did that strike you guys?
Is kind of badass. I thought it was really cool because a cataract, you might expect to see something like kind of reflecting weirdly off of it, but not it glowing green.
Yeah.
And I was really excited because I'm like, okay, he's not going to die. I'm totally wrong.
It is like, as our first like truly, I mean, other than the big flying saucer on the ground, our first truly like supernatural thing. But it's the first time that you're like, I know I mentioned this a lot in this podcast, but what are the rules here? What does this ship do exactly? Which, it's still early. We might find out. We won't. It's just some of the stuff this ship does, guys. You guys haven't read this before. From what I remember, it gets way crazier.
So the next day, she goes back out, bringing even more gear, ready to get more work done. And she starts seeing dead animals, just littered, dead birds. There's a dead woodchuck. No flies. Nothing has disturbed them. They're just flat out dead. That doesn't stop her. She still goes on digging, and she even says that despite everything, she knew no matter how much she fought it, she would be here and she'd be digging. Mm-hmm. She's like resigned herself to having no control of herself.
I think resigned herself isn't even the right. She hasn't even had the willpower to be able to resign herself.
Sure.
There's a part where as she's walking out, like she spends the whole day in her house being like, I would think about, I want to go out there and dig, and I would force myself to stop thinking about it. And 5 minutes later, I would realize I was still thinking about it. And when she finally goes out to hike out there with all her equipment, she's like, oh, maybe I'll dig for a little while. But then again, or until like my period starts back up. But then again, I did pack extra pads and things just in case. Yeah. And like I brought extra things, seeming like without even thinking about it.
She's become the property of whatever this thing is.
She's lost her autonomy.
Yeah.
And now we get to meet Jim Gardner. Who wants to tell us about Jim Gardner? You both seem very excited.
You came in rare and you said you had so many notes about Jim. I would love to hear your opinion. Bet we're going to agree on a lot of it.
I think pre-COVID, first read through, we would have.
Interesting.
All
right. So as Ben said, we read this book twice. And the second time I read through it, something interesting happened that changed the way completely that I am absorbing this story. When I first read it, it was very difficult to get into because the writing is very rambly. And Ben, you mentioned,
yes,
it's because Stephen King was addicted to substances while he was writing this. And like you said, he said that this book would be much better rewritten and way shorter. And I did really initially agree with that because it is so easy to lose the thread of what's happening in the story as the characters have a thought that they interrupt with another thought that they interrupt and then they come back and you're like, what's happening now? I mean, I had to read paragraphs over and over again just to follow that thread. I'm going to get a little bit real, which I know we don't always do that. We try to keep things somewhat lighthearted, but I think it's worth mentioning because during isolation, we've seen the rise of alcoholism, depression, suicide, and I don't want people to think that they're alone or they should be ashamed of that. And I recently almost lost someone very close to me because of late-stage alcoholism. And reading about Jim after that experience is something that I'm kind of still dealing with. It's so different now. Not only because the struggle is very real and visceral to me, but it's what is behind that struggle, and it's a person, Stephen King, on the edge of life. And this book has become a physical representation of King's struggles with substance abuse. And you read it and you're witnessing something tragic and alarming. And fortunately, he got help. So it didn't end badly. So it's tragic, alarming, and hopeful in a way. Addiction is a disease, one with a lot of stigma surrounding it. And it isolates people. And so then it becomes this vicious cycle because you're isolated. And this book puts King's experience, something a lot of people can unfortunately relate to, right out there in the light. And it's very vulnerable. And the rhythm of the writing it's initially a roadblock, but now it represents his journey, my journey, our journey, so many people who have experienced this. And it's like a milestone and a marker in his life that I think has a lot of significance, or it should have a lot of significance, because sometimes we're really fortunate and we can look back and say, shit, I really learned that lesson the hardest way possible. And that sucked, but I learned it. And now I've taken it and I've made it something positive in my life because I've created something good out of that. We don't always get that opportunity. For me, I don't want to do what I was initially doing, which was dismissing this book as the ramblings of an addict. because I think that diminishes King's journey and the journey that others have gone on and will continue to go on. And this book represents for me that it's not too late to get help. I don't know, like reading about what Jim does, because he is very much like late stage alcoholism. Mm-hmm. It was very profound this time.
Wow.
Sorry.
No, that is fascinating. I did not think of it that way at all. Yeah, making the book into an extension of the author. I mean, obviously, I was the one that brought up that this was his Coke book, but I always have a habit of, like, I always try to believe death of the author, you know, that the art should, as best we can, be separated from who or what created it, you know?
Yeah.
Although that is impossible. And I mean, definitely where he was shines through in this book.
It's like a talisman.
That's a fascinating point of view, and is gonna make talking about how much I fucking hate Jim Gardner as a character really difficult. I'm gonna thread this needle, guys.
That's why I wanted to get that out there, because I didn't want you to be like, fuck this guy, and then I'm like, this is really special to me now.
I'm glad. I will be respectful, because yes, addiction is a very serious problem. He is written as an addict pretty well. I buy into it. My problem is that we've talked about King has several unlikable protagonists. I'm fine with that. You know, I complained Louis Creed was unlikable at the beginning of Pet Sematary, and I grew to be, he's one of my favorite characters. Fatty Daddy is a wiener boy. So there are unlikable characters, but Jim Gardner is so extremely unlikable as a person.
But I think it's perfect, and I love that you feel that way about him and that you talk about that, because that is what alcoholism does to you. And the person that I was dealing with, I kind of lost sight of that. I started to see them as their disease, and it affected our relationship. And I had to remind myself, I'm looking at the alcohol. I'm not looking at them anymore. Like, I don't even know who they are.
There is evidence in the book, however, that the alcoholism was the end result, but it was not the base cause of why he is like this. Because it talks about how near the end of this section that we read, he's reflecting on his life, and he's reflecting on a lot of things, but he is saying that, what's the line? When I was young, when I was in my 20s, I burned all the time. And when I was in my 30s, I burned some of the time, and now I only burn when I drink. So he is a tragic character, but I just get the feeling he's always been an asshole.
And there is definitely evidence to back up that even without alcohol, Jim's not the greatest dude.
Yeah. And regardless of like the alcoholism, that angle of his character, giving us an unlikable character, is fine. We've had characters with addiction problems, but being like, here's our protagonist. Arguably, Jim is our protagonist of this book from here on out.
Yeah.
Here's our protagonist. He's an alcoholic. Okay, I can empathize with that. I've dealt with alcoholism myself. Like, I can empathize with that. He's an asshole. I can empathize with that. I've been an asshole in the past. Here's our protagonist. He shot his wife in the face.
In the face! On Thanksgiving.
It's just the amount of, like, just unlikable traits that he is given. It was a hard time for me. But I'm going to go in through the rest of the book with, I think, a really new outlook. I'm going to try and...
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what you said has definitely shown a different light on Jim. So let's get into Jim a little bit. When we first meet him, like one of the very first thing it says is that Jim Gardner went on an 8-day bender. The fall started in his hotel room, and it ended on the breakwater at Arcadia Bay, New Hampshire. we've talked a little bit about his self-destructive tendencies, him shooting his wife, those things that he carries with him. Essentially what we get in this first chapter is he's out on this poetry tour, and a friend of his takes him out with the intent of, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to get hammered. And that's what starts this spiral. He blacks out. He almost gets into a fight because talking about nuclear energy is his trigger. And boy, howdy, is it a weird trigger. But
oh God, I'm gonna relate to him on that too, you guys.
Oh, we're gonna have another disagreement then. This is gonna be interesting.
It gets so aggressive, he almost like gets the shit kicked out of him at a bar because of it, and he doesn't remember any of it. But he keeps coming back to having this feeling that Bobby's in trouble. But as soon as that happens, it comes and goes so fast, he just is moving on with his hangovers and his next blackout.
One other thing, it's not a feeling. Well, first of all, lazy writing. But I'm going to excuse it and say it's The Shining because it's indecipherable from but it's just the king trope of characters, quote, knowing stuff.
Yeah. Who else do we know that had The Shining and became an alcoholic trying to deal with The Shining? Danny Torrance.
Haven't read Dr. Sleep yet, my man.
Me neither.
Spoiler alert, he's an alcoholic. The cycle continues, but I wonder if Jim Gardner has The Shining and has no idea even what it is, if that noise in his head could be, one, mistaken for... He could have mistaken the quote-unquote voices in his head as a muse for his writing when it could have been the thoughts of people and what other people are going through filtering into his brain.
The person I'm most familiar with who has The Shining would probably be Jake. So we didn't get to see the outcome of Jake's Shining because, how that ended.
Sure.
So I wonder if substance abuse or some sort of mental health problem is a result of The Shining. Am I just, do we already know that? Am I just being dumb today?
Honestly, no. I think, even bringing it up, I was being very generous.
Oh, that's fair.
Because it's really just lazy writing to be like, we need Jim to want to go see Bobby. That's all that is.
Yeah.
But if you want to be nice, it's The Shining. Why not?
Yeah. Jim pulls himself together enough to go to his poetry reading that he's scheduled for and is falling apart. And he reads the poem Layton Street, which he wrote because of Bobby. I've never heard motherfucker used so liberally in poetry before until this poem. And somehow it gets a standing ovation for poetry.
Maybe the least believable part of this story. Not that I do not enjoy poetry or think it can get a standing ovation. I just think this poem could not get a standing ovation.
Well, and we get the poem, and then it says that he read it for like 20 minutes. Like, that's not a 20-minute long poem.
Yeah, it's and listening to this is the first book for the podcast I listened to with the audiobook. And the gentleman that reads the audiobook, I've heard him read a few other King books. I think he does a great job. But he has a very, very serious old man voice. And hearing him go, motherfucker, was very funny to me.
That's outstanding. At the end of this poem, though, we get our delicious foreshadowing that this is the last public reading he'll ever do. And then we go to a party thrown by my favorite character's name, Argle Bargle.
I have... okay, sorry. So the first time I listened to this, and I didn't like the kind of old man distinguished voice. And maybe it's because we started off with Bobby, and I always have sort of a disconnect there. And listening to him say Argle Bargle and Margle Bargle over and over again drove me batshit crazy.
Yeah, well, reading it over and over again isn't necessarily better. It's very Kingian. He thinks it's hilarious.
Yeah, well, and I feel like that's... Spoiler alert, I've been drunk before. And I've made a joke that I thought killed, and I've just called back to it all night, and it's really worn out its welcome.
Yeah. No,
and that's what this felt like.
We've done improv drunk together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that happens.
It does. So that rang very true to me of like the fact that Jim thinks this is hilarious. To summarize this party a little bit,
It needs summarizing.
It does. It really does. It culminates in him, Gardner, going from vodka tonics to glasses full of vodka. And then he picks a fight with a man he refers to as Ted the Power Man, who is talking to a group of Argle Bargle and Patricia McCardle, who is the lady who booked him on the tour that
Isn't
they
she
hate each other.
McCardle Bargle?
Yeah, he calls her McCargle Bargle, the vaudevillian duo of Argle Bargle and McCargle Bargle.
We've already said it too much.
I do like that Ted mentions the Arrowhead installation. I thought that was a really cool name drop. But it culminates in Gardner making the nuclear power man's wife sob because he rips into all the truth about the dangers of nuclear energy.
Okay. Jim's thing, I think more so than the alcoholism, more so than just being a dick, his thing is nuclear energy.
Yeah.
He is obsessed with it, and the drinking makes it worse, and all of this, but he's been arrested at protests against power plants and all this, but his whole driving motivation almost is his obsession that nuclear power plants are going to be the end of the world.
It's the
Bullshit.
80s.
Yes.
It's the 80s.
It's such, this whole rant, I stopped reading it as a book and just saw, I know I said death to the author, but this is just Stephen King forgot he was writing a book.
He was writing his TED Talk.
Yeah, exactly. It is all so 80s fear-mongery.
Yeah.
And does not hold up well. All the predictions, we're gonna lose, Denver and all that. And you go back into the past 30 years of nuclear power and now it's pretty safe, y'all.
Yeah, we're good.
It's the same reason that the Springfield power plant is always like depicted in The Simpsons as like falling apart and super unsafe.
Yeah.
It's because people were just afraid of it in the 80s and 90s. Doesn't hold up super well.
It held up for me because I could relate to it because I would call myself an environmentalist. Like environmental justice is very near and dear to me. And
I would too.
Yeah, I could easily understand why he was so passionate about something that at the time did not have all the safety precautions that it has now, because this is why we have those safety precautions. I don't know. I guess that kind of like was my gateway into it. It's like, okay, yeah, I could see, just apply this now to, I went to the Women's March and March for the Environment in Washington. And, you do get a little bit self-righteous maybe
Sure.
about that thing when it's, you're like sounding the alarm bells and trying to warn people. And so I've kind of felt like him, except I don't drink like that. So I've never totally lost my shit over it, but I could see how you would.
And screamed in a crying woman's face to make her cry more.
I can try next time.
Thank you. Well, and that's the thing, like, it's also kind of rough because there's moments where he checks in with himself and is like, oh, I shouldn't be screaming in this woman's face. Mm-hmm. But here's another thing. And like makes her cry.
Yeah, I think what gets her is when he's saying, hey, how close do you guys live to the power plant? Do you want to have kids?
Yeah. Completely unrelated. There's one part in the scene and several parts throughout the book. I just wanted to talk to you guys. Did you guys catch on? Stephen King had said this is a horrible book, but did you guys catch on to all of the little ideas sprinkled throughout the book that would go on to be used for years in other King books?
No.
Well, I caught some references to things.
There is something we haven't mentioned about Jim Gardner is he has a metal plate in his head from a skiing accident when he was younger. And there's a part Bobby is thinking about it, and she remembers a time where Gardner, drunk, stuck his finger in a light socket and picked up radio stations with his plate in his head. And she's looking at a thunderstorm and thinking about what strange power lightning has.
Revival.
Oh, that's awesome.
There is a rant. I forget at what part it is, but I think it's Bobby goes on this really actually amazingly written rant about quote, the Dallas police.
Oh, yeah.
Where I love this part of the book where she is talking about the problem with people in authority, and that it all started with when she was a kid seeing the assassination of JFK and then the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. And then she compares it to, the Dallas police did so well that they sent them out to take care of the Bay of Pigs and the hostage situation in the Middle East and all this, and saying the Dallas police is all of these failed.
Yeah.
I love that. But
And she mentions the shop, or he does, one of them.
Yeah.
They
mention
mention the shop. And specifically why I bring it up now is in this dinner party scene, as he's having this argument, he's drunk out of his mind, and he's so angry, and he looks around and sees that Ted the Power Man no longer has a human head. He has the head of a wolf.
Yeah.
And his wife has the head of a weasel. And the whole episode, or this whole segment, I could not help but think of the Tahine.
Yep.
And I'm like, I wonder how much of this book was just, he was like, that was nothing, but I like that idea. And I'm going to pick it up and put it somewhere else where it'll be used better.
It's more of an important book than you first think for a couple reasons.
But we're about to get into something. I feel like this episode's going to go on forever because we're never going to stop talking about the next thing.
Yeah.
He kicks the shit out of everybody leaving the apartment.
With an umbrella.
And an elbow to the heart. Great stuff. He just kicking ass, taking names on his way out. And then he gets into the hall and blacks out. He comes to in New Hampshire, having almost drowned on Arcadia Beach. And where do we know Arcadia Beach from?
The Talisman.
The Talisman.
He visits the Alhambra. He meets a Jack.
Oh, I have so many things to talk about with this. So this little kid comes up to him who's playing with fireworks because it's 4th of July. And that's how he registers that 8 days have passed. And this kid, he says the rhyme for the Tommyknockers. The late last night and the night before, Tommyknockers, knocking at the door. And then the kid does another verse, which I didn't write down. And they have this conversation. He says his name is Jack. Jack says to him, "You look like you've been drunk a long time." Gardner says, "Yeah, how do you know?" He says, "My mom. With her, it was always funny stuff like the Tommyknockers or too hungover to talk." He says, "She give it up?" And he says, "Yeah, car crash." So at first, I thought that this is a pretty tragic postscript to the story of the Talisman, of Jack saving his mom only for her to succumb to alcoholism and die in a car crash.
Which would be very king-like. He did that with Thad.
Sure did. True. However, something that I couldn't stop thinking about is that Jack does have somebody who died in a car crash, his dad. So it may be an indirect way of saying it because he doesn't want to dive into his whole family history. But is it possible that his mom drank a ton until his dad died and then she stopped drinking?
I guess,
I guess. I can't help but thinking this is just another level of the tower.
Yeah, it's not our Jack from the Talisman. It's a different Jack.
Spoilers for the Talisman, a book we have not covered yet.
Oh, it's so great, though.
It's such a good book, guys. Man, we got to do the Talisman.
Yeah, we do. The reason that I pulled that all together, I Googled if Jack from the Talisman was the same Jack in Tommyknockers. I was like, I'm just curious. I'll Google it, see if there are any theories out there. And the very first article that came up that confirmed that, like, yes, this is Jack from the Talisman was an article from our friend Bryant Burnett.
Hey!
It was written on his blog. He did a whole thing about it. And so that I just took directly from his article because I was like, this is it. All right, great.
Hey, radical.
Thanks, Bryant.
Yeah, so we stumbled on something from Bryant.
Good looking out, Bryant.
Yeah, right? After this interaction, Guard decides he was gonna kill himself, but he needs to see Bobby first because he's getting that feeling. So he hitchhikes his way there, finally arriving on Bobby's front step, only to be shocked by the fact that she looks like she's lost 30 pounds and hasn't slept in days.
I have one quick point to make.
Yeah.
I'm not going to dwell on it, But he gets a ride from a van full of hippies, basically. Just
They're in
like
a band.
Yeah, it's basically Charlie and Andy getting picked up by the weird hippie in Firestarter.
Yeah.
And as he's leaving, as they're dropping him off, they all see that he's in trouble. He doesn't have shoes. He's like looking really bad. So they pass around a hat to get money. And Gardner thinks, well, this is it. This is my rock bottom. He shot his wife in the face. You guys.
Let's not forget.
He shot his wife in the face and he's like, man, I've never been so low as to take money from nice strangers. What an asshole. And he's sober now, so fuck him.
he goes in and tells, like, he's gonna call an ambulance and call someone to take care of Bobby, and she threatens their friendship over him not calling someone. Which he does. He agrees to let her sleep and see in the morning. That night, he wakes up and he thinks he's still dreaming because there's a green light coming from Bobby's eyes, and she's turning to look at him. He closes his eyes, and when he opens them, she's back to having her eyes closed, being asleep, so he thinks it's all been a dream. It was definitely not a dream.
Yeah.
So the next morning, he wakes up, and Bobby basically just says, take a look around. I'm going to sleep some more, and then we'll talk. And he goes around the house, and she has redone everything in this house. She put a small sun inside her water heater.
She's become Tesla, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like beyond.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and they made a point in the early chapters to be like, she is not handy. I noticed on the second read through in the first chapter, she has a bookshelf that she built herself and it's shitty. And it is only there to, as a foreshadow to make you go, wow, how did she do this?
Yeah. She redoes her whole basement. She creates a telepathic typewriter that lets her write a 400-page book in 3 days. She mysteriously adds a gear on her Tomcat that just says up. And I sure hope that comes back. I really am very interested about that. But then we get the sad news that Peter has died of old age. But for some reason, Guard just doesn't believe that.
So I have a question for you guys. We know what Bobby's powers are, and we know that Pete's was that he was becoming younger and healthier. And I don't know, Ben, maybe you have to hold back on this one since you've read it. But I've been wondering, so we find out by the end of book 1 that whatever is happening extends out a few miles and is affecting the other townspeople. But Bobby's the only one who had actually touched it. And so is Pete's condition and the townspeople's changes a product of whatever is emanating from the saucer, or is it part of Bobby's powers? And I know it makes it seem like it's something coming from the saucer, but this thing has sat here for millions of years. And if it was this powerful, like, does that mean its biggest weakness was just dirt covering it? Does it need like a conduit, and that conduit is Bobby? Because she spends the first part of this book lamenting Pete's old age, knowing that she's going to have to put him down eventually. And then suddenly he's getting younger. So maybe his power is a manifestation of what she wanted subconsciously for him, which was not to lose him.
Well, I actually have an answer for this.
Oh, okay.
And it's only in what we have read so far.
Okay.
It has to do with the biggest problem of the book, which is the theme of the book, which is nuclear power. This book is about nuclear power.
Yeah.
You said an interesting thing is the only weakness of this really powerful whatever it is that's causing all of this.
Thinking
dirt.
Sand. Yeah.
Radioactive waste, when it is done, all they do is bury it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they cover it in cement and stuff, but burying it is a way to keep the radiation out. And Bobby says, as she's talking about all of this, that like she believes that as she is uncovering more of the hull of this ship, that it is somehow oxidizing. And there's not a gas, not a poisonous gas, but there's something that as more of it is uncovered, there is more of it extending and reaching and affecting more people, which is just radiation. It's a stand-in for nuclear waste.
Mm-hmm.
Her gadgets, they call it, are stand-ins for nuclear power. It's this incredibly powerful power source that is seemingly miraculous, but there's some unknown danger to it. It's a metaphor for the nuclear panic of the 80s. So I forgot where this question started.
No, I was just, part of me, just because of the way they set up Bobby and Pete's interactions, part of me was like, does she have some sort of influence over what is happening to Pete? Or is that entirely the ship?
It's this power or this whatever this entity is, because she keeps saying they.
Yeah.
They are talking to her. They are reading her mind and saying, oh, she's worried that her dog's going to die. And that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a good theory.
I just wanted to talk about how it's
Nuclear
all
power.
a metaphor.
So after touring all these inventions, Bobby tells him the whole story from start to finish, minus what they told her not to tell him. They have said to her that she needs to watch Guard closely until he's essentially on the team. She takes him out to the saucer. She's dug even more of it out. They have to slide down because so much of it's been dug out. All she wants is for Guard to touch it. But she's trying not to be too pushy because she doesn't want him to know how badly she wants it. And when he finally does, he feels that vibration. A song broadcasts into his head, and he gets a torrential nosebleed. Something about, and that's when we get the evidence that not only is the plate affecting Bobby not being able to read his mind, because she said she's tried.
Oh, yeah, by the way, Bobby can read people's minds.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she tried to read his mind and can't. She didn't even want to find out, but she found out her mailman was having an affair, was cheating on his wife, just because he was nearby, and she just picked it up. But it's somehow his metal plate is causing that interference. They get back to the house, and Guard notices Bobby has a new padlock on her shed. They sit down to talk about all their options, and Bobby doesn't. She even has to ask, hey, did we go out to the ship? Because I feel like we did, but I can't remember. So, red flags. They have what I thought was a really good discussion. Ben, this is where they talked about the Dallas police point of that, or calling the Air Force, and how anybody, if they go too far outside, they'll lose control of all this. They'll probably either get locked up or killed. All of these advances will be taken away and locked away, and it'll help no one.
This is where they mention the shop.
Yeah.
It's like if the shop found this, they'd shit themselves.
Right. And Bobby's master plan is to dig until they find a hatch, climb it, and fly that sumbitch out.
Can I say that I totally agree with her? And I know
No, it's a
that's
good
shitty, but
theory.
like, just so you guys know this about me, okay, if vampire ever knocks on my window, letting it in to bite me. Aliens ever abduct me, I'd be like, don't take me home, let's go explore space. And if I found a flying saucer, I would crawl inside. I mean, you have to.
You have to.
That's fair.
Bobby turns in for the night, and Guard sees her sleeping, and he takes a walk outside, and he's just kind of weighing his options, trying to figure out what the best thing is.
Oh, this pissed me off so bad.
Really? Oh,
Yes.
I really enjoyed this.
I did too.
He's sitting on a stump in her yard trying to sort it out, and then it cuts to inside, and he has no idea that Bobby is standing in the kitchen holding a shotgun.
Oh, no, that
to
was
the back
awesome.
of his head.
Because she can't read his mind, but she can kind of get a sense of what he's thinking.
Yeah.
So she's waiting for him to make a decision, and
Yeah.
depending on what it is, she doesn't want to kill him, but she
Yeah.
will if she
No,
has to.
that's awesome. Like, that's very tense, and like made me maybe the first time in the book that I'm like, oh shit, that was like really on the edge of my seat.
Is the thing you're talking about when he's like, this is the solution to the energy crisis and
Yes.
clean energy. Yeah.
My problem is Gardner, on top of being an asshole, is a massive hypocrite. He spent the whole book being like, nuclear power is bad. There's no scientific proof that it's killing people, but I know it's bad because I don't understand it. And then they find a alien spaceship that is doing something to his friend, and he's like, you know what would solve the solution to the energy crisis? If I dug up this thing we know nothing about and hope it does something. He's even like, maybe it has weapons that we can use.
Yeah, that's
I'll
crazy.
be the man in power.
But I love his hypocrisy, because when you're that passionate about something, you always feel so justified. in your point of view. And it's so hard to make that connection and bridge that gap and listen to someone else. You end up, people don't listen to each other anymore. They just argue. So seeing him first view that thing as a weapon that he could use for good, and it would eliminate environmentally destructive sources of energy, so he's all about it. And then he starts to think of it like nuclear power and realizes if this falls into the wrong hands, like other things that have, this could be really bad. I don't know. I liked seeing him wrestle with that hypocrisy in a way.
He does.
It's very humbling.
He is eventually a little self-aware about it. But just the fact that he's like, no, we could do so much good with this thing we know literally nothing about.
It's so attractive, though, that idea that you could save the world.
Yeah, and
it makes you blind sometimes.
The thing that he says about how he's only wanting to do it because he's, for the first time in his life, in a position of power, and that this would put him on top for once, even if his baseball team sucked.
You know what he's the champion of? Shooting his wife. So he makes this decision, goes back inside, and goes and checks on Bobby, and it looks like she hasn't moved from the last time he saw her. She's back in bed sleeping sound. This is a little unrelated, but I made a note because I needed to talk to Ben about it. They name drop Peter Straub in this scene, and I wanted to tell you something, Ben. We've had our run-in with the talisman already in this book, and I know your favorite character in all of Kingdom, Bango Skank.
Yes, of course.
It turns out Peter Straub created Bango Skank.
What?
Yeah, he created Bango Skank for the talisman, but never used him in that book. His first appearance is actually in one of Straub's short stories, The Buffalo Hunters, in Houses Without Doors. And in a email or something, or a letter from Stephen King, or an interview, he said that Bango Skank just keeps popping up in his work like some kind of boogeyman. And that's why he likes Bango Skank.
I have Houses Without Doors on my bookshelf at home. I'm going home to read that.
Let us know.
That's fascinating.
That's amazing. So we end this first book with Guard dreaming that he's going to go into the shed and the Tommyknockers will be in there and he will see them. Then the green light fills the shed and he thinks, if cancer had a light, it would be that color of green. He can't help but approach it, and as he peers in, his head explodes and he wakes up.
His head explodes as George Strait wails a sweet guitar solo.
George Thorogood?
George Thorogood. Sorry. Yeah.
What a crazy way to end this first book.
Yeah, it only gets crazier, guys.
Oh, God, I can't wait.
I don't remember a lot, but the things I remember are 1,000% insane.
That's it for this episode of Derry Public Radio. As always, thank you for listening. Join us next time where we cover Book 2, Tales of Haven. For Joshua Kahn and Benjamin Graham, I'm CM Alexander, reminding you, only obsessives worry about obsession. Hey everyone, CM Alexander here. Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Tommyknockers. Did you guys know that between 1986 and 87, King published It, Misery, and the Tommyknockers? Anyway, just thought I would share that fun tidbit with you. As always, follow us on social media at Derry Public Radio. Email us at derrypublicradio@gmail.com. Check out our Patreon page for bonus episodes and cool merchandise. And check out our website, constantreaders.org, for everything Stephen King and Stephen King adjacent. That's all for now, listeners. Goodbye.